I've titled my paper, Essential Workers, Essential Services? Leitourgia in Light of Lockdown, and I'd like to begin with a small caveat. What follows are my own reflections as a pastoral liturgical theologian on my experience as a pastor and presider after the suspension of in-person worship. I mean it as a critical reflection and evaluation of my own practice, though I hope that some of it might be useful to others as they reflect on their own contexts. Within days of the outbreak of COVID-19, the language of what is essential became commonplace. Those judged essential workers included healthcare employees, first responders, public servants, and many in the retail sector. This designation unveiled the relative value assigned to the work and the workers required to maintain the essential. Many roles are poorly compensated, and many workers belong to gender, racial, and ethnic groups that have suffered historic and systemic policies of inequality and exclusion. These essential workers were assigned to take the risk of providing essential services during the pandemic, while simultaneously continuing to bear long-standing injustices based on race, gender, and class. Church work, in its customary in-person forms, fell among what was deemed non-essential and thus exempt from such risks. My own context, in this case, was a mid-sized suburban Episcopal church where I was interim pastor, and whose members were primarily white, largely professional, financially secure with some exceptions, and generally progressive in terms of politics and theological outlook, if not terribly politically active. Few of us were counted among essential workers. Soon after the suspension of in-person worship, the assembly began a weekly Zoom liturgy of the word, which provided the primary moment of interpretation, first of the pandemic with its uneven effects, and second of the concurrent public responses to police violence against Black bodies and Black citizens. Still, while some of our prayer did attempt to address these events, its primary audience was members of the church. It may have been essential to us, but likely to few others. Much reflection on liturgical prayer in an online environment echoes this instinct about common prayer during the pandemic as intra-church. Among the topics producing widespread commentary, for example, is whether it is possible to celebrate virtual Eucharist, with concern primarily for church members deprived of communion. I have noticed comparatively less reflection on the loss of the Assembly's liturgia in proposing the reign of God as an alternative to the current economic and political order, now magnified by the pandemic, for example, in the explosion of food insecurity. Yet the consumer economy has continued to function more or less without major interruption, and maintaining it judged worthy of the risk of infection among essential workers. Their work has in turn yielded immense profits for a few, exacerbating the already overwhelming wealth and income divide across the very race, class, and gender lines traced in the judgment of what is essential work. The narrow focus among many church commentators on Eucharist or its absence suggests to me Eucharist as yet another consumable product that doesn't particularly disrupt or interrogate the marketplace and its effects. This congruity calls to mind Daniel Rhodes's commentary on the failure of Christian liturgy to engage disaster capitalism, through which public goods are privatized to generate profit in response to disaster. Rhodes sees a need for, quote, a liturgy interfused with a counter-politics, but it would be hard to argue that many churches' public service has yet risen to this task in the matter of COVID, much less been ready to bear the risks that might be involved in doing so. This is arguably a pre-existing condition, as Claudio Carvalles makes clear in his description of a dichotomy in much liturgical and theological thinking between praxis and doxa, between prayer and mission. At first glance, such challenges may seem beyond the reach of any assembly's liturgia, no matter how well-intentioned. Nevertheless, as Hilton Scott argues, the pandemic has thrust assemblies into an unusual experience of liminality. The liturgical status quo is no longer able to function. He sees this time, and I agree, as a creative open space for assemblies to seek new forms of contextual koinonia and communitas, which, in light of the pandemic, our received liturgical practices appear limited in their ability to propose. A promising place to engage this creative space is in dialogue with those who refused to comply with the public orders to suspend their liturgia in response to the inequalities unveiled in this time. What adjustments do they propose to Christian liturgy that might amplify its public service, even render it essential? Among those refusing to comply with restrictions on in-person gatherings were the millions who gathered to protest police violence against Black bodies and citizens. My participation in one of these stirred my own thinking about the liturgia of the churches, a strategy Sharon Fenema has deployed in her own reflections on marches protesting gentrification in Oakland, California. The march in question gathered several thousand people in Chicago's Lakeview neighborhood, a center of LGBTQIA culture and entertainment. It is, however, as organizers pointed out, one with a history of excluding Black and transgender members of the rainbow. Notably, a majority of those gathered were non-Black, which became clear as the protest unfolded and reflected the city's well-documented racial segregation by neighborhood. A number of elements would be familiar to anyone in a church on Sunday. First were the litanies that accompanied the mile-long procession, dominated by say, their, her, his name, depending on the gender identity of the victim of police violence being named. These were interspersed with broadly familiar chants that marked civil rights protests: no justice, no peace. This is what democracy looks like. The cumulative effect echoed liturgical lament, though in this predominantly white North Side assembly, it also had the feel of a confession, perhaps in response to a call from the march's Black leadership. The embodied juxtaposition between call and response, refracted through those racial identities, calls to mind Carvalho's identification of the limits of most generalized denominational confessions, which, quote, seldom make us think about real reparations to Black and Indigenous people. Unlike most church litanies, however, these arose from various groups within the processing assembly and were often modified in the chanting. It evoked for me Aidan Kavanaugh's description of the many-to-many interaction characteristic of liturgical prayer. Once the procession arrived at a major intersection, the organizer shifted to presider, directing this assembly's attention, proposing and modeling what to do, and yielding to other voices. The call to order began with the presider inviting any Black persons present to come up to the front, with the rest of the assembly parting to create an aisle and spontaneously applauding as Black and Black trans persons filtered forward. Their appearance at the end of the procession suggested to me the customary place of the vested ordained ministers in an Episcopal procession. While I feared it appears clerical there, in the case of the protest, it seemed a felicitous ordering of this assembly, with Black and transgender bodies proposed as privileged norms. A call to order followed, involving instructions to those gathered to kneel on the pavement and hold a nearly 9-minute silence to recall George Floyd's suffocation. While I've experienced such silences in Christian liturgy, the sacred space created by contact with asphalt and the press of people gave it a profound and amnetic character, both embodied and empathetic, that Fenema finds in Oakland. While it echoed one particular crucifixion, it refracted those terrible minutes in a way that made present countless others. It further proposed a vicarious identification with its victims, among those, such as myself, who had never experienced its direct effects. Though displaced from Minneapolis, the asphalt common to every American city, combined with the bodies pressed against it, evoked the character of a liturgical real symbol. The action effectively made present the place of Floyd's death and referred further to Chicago's own places of similar deaths. This example of protest suggests to me some dimensions of liturgical practice that need attention if liturgies are to offer the essential public service of a countersign to the political and economic status quo. First among these is a shift in mentality for many assemblies, my own included. We must adopt the attitude that, like a public protest, our primary audience is the polis, not the ecclesia. The purpose of being called out is to render a public service so essential that salvation, incarnationally manifested in the flourishing of those made marginal, depends on it. Building on that shift in attitude, the correlative need to adjust the assembly's common action and the manner of its address in prayer becomes clear. I would argue that the relative passivity of many assemblies in relation to the world is directly related to the passivity they experience in most liturgical celebrations. Most remain in their places from beginning to end. Any marching is limited to a few designated for that purpose, and chanting is carefully ordered to certain voices. If liturgy is to be not only an act of public theology, or as Sally Brown describes it, formation in, quote, discerning the public presence of God, the manner of its celebration is every bit as important as the words it voices. Brown's concern about the weak connection between liturgical practice and public action suggests a need for a ritual vernacular that accessibly proposes the essential relationship between liturgy and the Missio Dei. An imagination shaped to make that connection needs a regular embodied poiesis, a ritual vernacular, to, in the words of Charles Fensham, quote, aid in the formation of collective identity, the creation of free space, the harnessing of emotions, and the shaping of a culture of advocacy and change. In the matter of gathering, then, whenever possible, a more porous entrance from outside the church is in order. In the assembly I served, the opening procession obscured this connection by beginning and ending indoors, from the front of the space for worship to the back and up front again. Nothing suggested the completion of a gathering bearing the liturgy of the world in from out there. A fairly straightforward adjustment would be to begin outside and include a more representative procession, not limited to those members of the assembly who have roles of leadership. To the extent that such a procession orders the assembly, it should reflect as much as possible the differences gathered, particularly those marginalized either outside the assembly or within it. Every assembly bears differences that are shunted to the side or excluded, whether based on age or ability or neurological function, not to mention race and cultural heritage. The shape of an assembly's gathering is, in the words of Carvalles, an opportunity to ascribe worthiness or honor to somebody or something, as the street protest did in calling forth the Black and transgender members of that assembly. Despite the real risks of failure in the Christian assembly, for example, the danger of tokenism, the gathering is a moment for an assembly to state what qualities in itself it proposes to value. As to the word and song that gathered the assembly, while the chants may differ from those found at a protest, the manner of their leadership and performance could better correspond to it. The call to prayer, for example, need not originate from the same voice. Indeed, in the case of a procession with some already in place and some moving through, the dialogue might be between those groups, laying the groundwork for the many-to-many interactions of the liturgy as it unfolds. The prayers of the people offers further opportunity for active communal engagement beyond their content. The diversity of voices that entered the room needs refraction in its prayers for the world. There is no reason beyond the logistics of finding enough willing voices for there to be a single prayer leader, nor to restrict the prayers themselves to what is printed on a page. The Korean prayer pattern Tongtsung Kido, which includes an invitation to prayer, space for free intercession from the assembly's members, and a sung response has promising possibilities for contextualizing such prayer of the people. After such prayers, most assemblies of my experience turn to the table and its proposal of communitas or koinonia within and beyond the gathered group. This turn is harder to discern in the liturgy of public protest. Though the 9 minutes of silence held by the real symbol of all those bodies pressed to pavement did evoke a unity across difference, perhaps without proposing its reconciliation. Whatever its intent, It embodied a compelling ritual vernacular available across differences of race, class, wealth, gender, orientation, age. It suggested what M. Sean Copeland has called a praxis of solidarity, which she connects to Eucharist, embodied at an intersection and in the intersections of those gathered. How often do Christian assemblies render their public service in such accessible and compelling ways? What may be lacking in many assemblies is the ritual vernacular that makes the connection between the Eucharist and the hunger in one's own backyard a more accessible dimension of the assembly's imagination. Put plainly, if the poesis of Eucharist had been doing its essential public service all along, there would be no hunger at all, at least within reach of any who celebrate the Eucharist. Yet the pre-existing hunger starkly exposed in the pandemic also reveals the relatively weak effect much Eucharistic liturgia has had on the hunger it is meant to contest. An embodied expression of this commitment, like the march that gathered the assembly, must surely include more than a few representatives bearing meager gifts rendered invisible by their containers and handed over to clergy at a distant table. A more fulsome procession of full hands, bearing a wider range of gifts, would better propose a vernacular, real symbol of a meal able to feed everyone. This must surely include the assembly pressing close to its own table, the infrastructure of the meal analogous to the asphalt of the city liturgy, to experience its own Eucharistic solidarity with all who hunger. A Eucharistic practice with a more outward turn might also call into question any fencing of the meal. While open table practice disrupts the expectation of baptism before communion, it also suggests a broader Catholicity in the meal, not least in a culture in which access to food is fenced. David Jacobson argues this requires a shift in Eucharistic imagination from private visions of family dinner in favor of a public banquet. The qualifying difference between the baptized and others gathered is that the former have a particular Christian appreciation of what God is doing in them. A less well-defined or simply different understanding brought by someone who does not share Christian faith do not mean exclusion from the symbol. On the contrary, it may contribute to the surplus of meaning that is the hallmark of liturgical prayer. This inevitably leads to the adjournment of the assembly's gathering until next time. As the assembly entered, so it goes out, as a body to do the work the Spirit groans to have its members do. Moving through the liturgy together as if in pilgrimage might propose what Christopher de Reising has called the concursus Dei, God's unceasing accompaniment with creation, calling and evoking the assembly's participation in God's movement, as God leads it patiently and persuasively, both in judgment and grace, to its future, in God's future. And those are Christopher's words. As I reflect on my own context, a church that shares a parking lot with a local hospital, among the first to treat patients with COVID-19 in Illinois, I wish I had had the imagination to suggest that we take some of the risk asked of those essential workers, to gather in the safest way possible for a liturgy of pilgrimage around that hospital. Its stations might have refracted in lament, confession, and prayer, the risk borne by the essential public service of those caught between a natural pathogen and societal failure to engage it. I can imagine us calling the names of those bearing that risk and inviting their prayers and conversation with hospital staff. Perhaps family members excluded from accompanying their loved ones might have joined us, enriching the symbol beyond our members and proposing a shared koinonia of common vulnerability to COVID-19. As that liturgy changed, it may have drawn greater attention to the injustices unveiled and magnified over these many months and invited those gathered to action. We could not have saved anyone, but as we surrounded and joined those most affected, we might have signified that concursus Dei, in the words of de Reising, mirroring the divine accompaniment through solidarity and compassion with all.